Hello everyone. Welcome to another episode of Business Talk podcast. I am Deepak, your host. I am delighted to welcome Professor Dale Copeland, Professor of International Relations at the University of Virginia and a leading expert on the origins of great power economic and military conflict as well as U.S. China strategic competition as our esteemed guest on today's podcast episode. Professor Copeland's research explores the complex dynamics of international relations with particular emphasis on the origins of economic interdependence between great powers, the logic of reputation building, bargaining and coercion theory, the interplay between trade, finance, and militarized behavior, and how shift in economic and military power influence state behavior. Professor Copeland is the author of The Origins of Major War, published by Cornell University Press, and many influential articles published in leading journals such as International Security, Security Studies, and the Review of International Studies. His book, Economic Interdependence and War, published by Princeton University Press, received the International Studies Association Best Book Award in 2017. Professor Copeland earned his PhD from the University of Chicago and has received numerous honors for his work, including MacArthur and Mellon Fellowships and a postdoctoral fellowship at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard University. In this episode, Professor Dale Copeland shares valuable insights from his book, A World Safe for Commerce, American Foreign Policy from the Revolution to the Rise of China. So without further delay, let's welcome Professor Dale Copeland to the podcast. Professor Dale, it's an honor and privilege to have you join us today.
Great to be here, Deepak.
Professor, can you explain the central thesis, how commerce shapes U.S. foreign policy, and why this dynamic has been historically overlooked?
Oh, great. And I'll try to keep it short. The basic point comes out of the second book, Economic Interdependence and War, that great powers tend to go to war if they're very commercially dependent, such as Japan 1941, when they fear the future, when they fear that they are being cut off from raw materials, markets, and investments abroad. And in a nutshell, this is what I call the trade expectations approach to thinking about great power relations. Great powers compete, and they compete for military position, of course, but they also compete for control of their trade routes and their economic sources of supply and livelihood. So if they fear the future, if they have negative expectations for the future, they will likely think that their power position will start to decline over time. And again, think of Japan 1941. When Japan got cut off from raw materials and oil, it feared the long-term decline of its position and therefore felt that it was a now or never kind of situation, that they had to go to war sooner rather than later to gain access to raw materials and markets that they felt they were being denied. Now, I take that argument to the situation of the US, or the let's call it the United States of America, but also the British North Americans prior to the unification of the colonies in the American War of Revolution. And over this 250-year period, I asked the question, how often does commerce cause America to either stay at peace, which is very important? When you have positive expectations, you want the future to continue without war because you're growing through trade. You want that growth. Think of China since 1980. It grows through trade, therefore it wants peace. But how often is it the case that the American wars, from the American War of Revolution to the World War I and the entry of Wilson into World War I to some of the wars recently, that how often have they been driven by commerce? And then specifically, my issue, which is changing expectations of trade. So I don't want to belabor the historical chapters in this new book, A World Safe for Commerce, except to say that there's some really big surprises. Even for me, very much surprised by looking at the documents carefully and seeing just how important commerce was to these big conflicts that we know from a historical angle and have been shown to or have believed to be about ideology or about domestic politics. I say no. Largely, it's about commerce. And my most obvious case is Wilson getting into World War One, where we wonder, first of all, why did he wait 3 years to get into World War One? But why did he finally decide to do so? Well, we tend to think of it as this is the play on the word, the phrase, a world safe for democracy. We think that Wilson, when he said that, was really thinking that we needed war. We, the Americans, needed war for spreading democracy or making the world safe for democracy. In fact, he was really trying to make the world safe for commerce. Most importantly, he feared that the Germans would restrict America's long-term growth through its submarine policy, and it's an alliance, it's proto-alliance with Mexico of all countries. And he felt he had to act before the Germans won the war in Europe and then started to infiltrate or restrict American growth in the Western Hemisphere, as well as in East Asia. So that war is an interesting one because let's just say Wilson was not a Wilsonian. He was a realist. He thought about power politics from this economic point of view and decided to push the United States into a major war for economic reasons. The same goes for FDR getting into World War II, fearing Hitler's control of South America, but also of the Middle East oil. But we also have the Cold War, where a lot of this struggle for 45 years had very much to do with the fear of the Soviet penetrating that arc of territory that goes from Britain through India all the way to Japan, and that fear that if the U.S. did not contain the Soviet economic growth, it would be a long-term threat to the United States. The parallel today, of course, is China. Is China growing its economy to a point where it might overtake the U.S. and become the dominant economic power? And to what extent is the very effort to keep China down or to restrict it going to lead to something like 1941, where the US kept Japan down and it led to a war? So, this is the thing that I'm currently working on, which is a new book on the lessons from history for US China relations.
Very insightful. Professor, how does this dual nature of commerce challenge the conventional liberal belief that economic interdependence leads to peace?
Well, this is a very important point, Deepak, because our tendency is to say, well, US and China, if they trade, they won't go to conflict with one another. We call that in my field of international relations the liberal perspective. And yes, that's very much true. But it depends on a key condition that both sides have very positive expectations of the future trading relationship. In other words, I go away from that snapshot and say, oh, do two states have a lot of trade? Yes, the US and China have a lot of trade, uh, unbelievable amounts, over $600 billion worth of trade historically. And that amount of trade can indeed give an incentive for peace. This is why China does not want to decouple, let alone get into a Cold War. It's very dependent on US trade and investments. But also the US has a lot of reason. Think of the rare earths that the United States gets from China, the world's leading producer of rare earths material. The US needs those rare earths for almost everything it does at the high tech level. So this dependency can be a very important source for peace. In fact, I would argue the most important source for peace between the US and China. Yet, it can also be the most important source or potential source for war or conflict. Why? Because if you're very dependent and you need the other, and then you suddenly feel like they're cutting you off or they're going to cut you off, you get into that negative expectation of the future, Japan 1941, and you start to feel the what we call the costs of adjustment. You start to fear that your economy is not going to grow, but it's going to peak and decline. And once it starts to peak and decline, then you say now or never. We've got to start moving towards attacking Southeast Asia or controlling our oil supply from the Middle East. And that could be a very dangerous situation. Now, that's what we might think of as the realist side of this, that high dependence can lead to conflict. And the realists are right, but they're both right but they don't understand how you can have both of them work at the same time. And that's why this extra factor, this extra variable of expectations of future trade and investment is so critical because it allows you to see when the liberal argument will work when trade expectations are positive, and when the realist side of interdependence being potentially conflict driven, when that works, when of course there are negative expectations for the future. And that's the subtlety, you might say, of my argument for this book, as well as the previous book.
Can you unpack this idea and explain how it differs from traditional realist and liberal approaches to international relations?
Sure. Well, I kind of explained how it differs from liberalism because the liberals, well, liberalism is a big tent, lots of different theories in it. And we often think of liberalism as of having three main pillars. One pillar is this idea that the more democracies, the more peaceful. I'm not really dealing with that right now, but we can talk about how it might relate to trade. The other pillar is, of course, the idea that institutions are important, like League of Nations or the United Nations. Most people don't focus that much on that pillar. The other third pillar, though, is the key one here, and that's trade. And the liberals believe more trade leads to more peace, simply because you have an incentive to stay peaceful if you're trading. Okay, good. And I've explained how that's right if both if there's that extra factor of expectations of the future is positive, because then both sides say, hey, I'm secure, I can trade with China and China trades with us, and we both get something out of it, and we expect to continue to get something out of it. That's the key. Now, the realist view, again, a very big tent. Think of John Mearsheimer, Steve Walt, Robert Jervis, all these different well-known scholars. The realist view, in a nutshell, says the future is uncertain. Therefore, great powers will try to build their power now to hedge against problems later. They will try to stay strong. If they're dominant, they'll try to stay dominant. Or if they're lower down, they'll try to close the gap so that power can serve as a tool for security over the long term. That's realism in a nutshell. Almost all realists believe in that part of it, but they differ in terms of what I would call their fundamental optimism or pessimism about how well great powers can solve the problem of cooperation. Offensive realists like John Mearsheimer tend to argue that they can never really solve this problem of the future, the problem of future cutoff or future war. So they're always struggling for more power now. They're always struggling to gain a little bit of an advantage. My view, based around more Steve Walt and Robert Jervis, is that there's a security dilemma that has to be taken into account. What is a security dilemma? It's simply what you know, that if you put your fist in the face of another and say, I'm going to protect myself for my own security, they start to worry about you. And they start to think, oh, you might be aggressive. And for security reasons, they respond with things like, oh, I'm going to put my fist in your face. This is, of course, a classic problem that great powers tend to over emphasize their need for assertiveness or their need to be hard line in the face of the other state. And you get missile crises, you get spirals of arms racing, you get struggles for raw materials. And that was, of course, in a way, what happened in East Asia in the 1930s that led to Japan's attack in 1941. Struggle over raw materials can lead to war. Well, the defensive realists, the Steve Walt and Robert Jervis's of the world, will say, no, you have to take into account that rational actors fear the spiral. They fear this escalation of hostility and mistrust that can lead to wars that neither side wants. Now, what do I do? What I do is simple. I fuse the realist insights. I take Mearsheimer and the view that you need to be ready for the future with the defensive realist notion that you have to be worried about over hardline policies, too much assertiveness that leads to a spiral of mistrust. And smart actors, rational security driven actors are going to play the trade-offs here. They're going to do what Xi Jinping does. They're going to expand their economic sphere, Belt Road Initiative to Africa, South America, of course, Southeast Asia, but they're also going to try to not do this in an overly hostile way. They're not going to put military troops in Ecuador. They're going to try to help Ecuador or Colombia or Brazil develop its economy without the sort of missile crisis problem we had with the Soviet Union. So if you can see what's going on here, I'm arguing that if the US and the Chinese, bottom line, are both rational and driven by security, they can have their cake and eat it too. They can build up their economies, they can grow their economies, they can increase their access to raw materials and markets, Belt Road Initiative again, without necessarily provoking this spiral of hostility and mistrust that can lead to cutoffs in trade, that can lead to actors saying, we won't give you the rare earth materials that you need, or we won't allow you to sell your goods into the US anymore. This is why I am concerned, of course, with the potential for high tariffs with China. US tariffs with China could lead to that spiral, that decoupling that China worries about. And China could respond with military action, or they could respond with an increased arms race in naval power. We can avoid that. And we can avoid that by learning from history, learning from logic, and how to bring together these different realist elements so that both sides avoid the very historical conflicts that have led to such disasters like the Pacific War 1941. World War I was also, to be honest, driven by economics. I showed that in my second book. The Germans feared that they were being cut off from access to oil, raw materials, markets abroad, and they felt that with the rise of Russia and the Russians aligning with the French and the British, they were economically encircled, and therefore they had to break out of that before it was too late. And they attacked the Russians before, while Germany was still strong, before the Russians and the French and the British overwhelmed Germany. So there are a lot of good historical parallels here, and of course, a lot in my new book, A World Safe for Commerce, that we can talk about. But the bottom line is, if we learn from history, we can avoid the problems of history.
Dr. Copeland, how did concerns about commerce and national security influence early American conflicts like Revolutionary War and the War of 1812? Were these wars driven by more ideology or by anxieties about trade access?
Well, what you're asking is whether ideology or domestic issues like the elites wanting more land for their slave owning societies, or whether they wanted more control over business and therefore greed was driving things like the American Revolutionary War or the War of 1812, or whether it's this larger strategic logic that I'm putting forward, which is that elites transcend their own selfish desires and understand that to protect their own societies, they need to have access to raw materials and markets. And this is fascinating because most scholars, most realist scholars, avoid the historical cases of American foreign policy. I talk about this in the very opening of my book, A World Safe for Commerce. Why do realists avoid the American case? Why do they focus on Japan or European cases? Because they think that the Americans are different. They think that America was founded on ideology of freedom and liberal democracy, and of course institutions and the spreading of institutions abroad. Well, I'm trying to give a wake up call to historians, but also to realists out there to say no. In fact, if there's an irony here, is that the Americans are perhaps the most realpolitik actors out there. They're very, very smart when it comes to long term power. If you define power in commercial and economic terms and not just in military terms. Now, how does this work? Well, let's take these two cases you mentioned. Obviously, the Declaration of Independence, 1776, but also the War of 1812, both of them with Britain. Now, why is that, first of all, important? Because Britain was, at least nominally, a quasi liberal state. Maybe not a full democracy by any means, but it had a lot of liberal values. That's important because we tend to think in liberalism, that theory of liberalism, that states that have liberal democratic foundations are not going to fight each other. So why did they fight? That's a puzzle. The second thing that's important is to ask whether the traditional view of a lot of liberal historians that the War of Independence, the Revolutionary War, was caused by this desire for freedom and liberal democracy, or no taxation without representation is often the phrase that high school kids get in the United States historical classes. Well, this is not true. Oddly enough, it's been put forward by very important historians like Gordon Wood and Bernard Bailyn, and they themselves, in retrospect, have now argued recently that in fact it was about power. It was that in fact the ideological side of this, fighting for democracy, really kicked in after 1775, 76. In other words, it was a mobilizing force. It was a way to get people to fight and die for this cause of uniting the colonies against Britain and fighting a long war. And George Washington was very effective in using that to facilitate the war. But what actually propelled or caused the war, it has a lot more to do with, you guessed it, the British trying to keep the British North Americans, the Americans, down, to keep them economically inferior to the British state. And they feared the long-term rise of the United States would cause Britain to lose its empire and to be facing a long term threat from the British North Americans. In short, it's actually quite similar to China today, where the Americans are worried about the long term growth of China. Back then, it was the British worried about the long term growth of the Americans. Now, how do we know this? Well, a couple of quick things. In 1751, Benjamin Franklin wrote a famous article, wasn't published for a few years, but he argued that, look, I know you're worried about us, says Benjamin Franklin. I know you're worried, Britain, that we're going to overtake you. And we are likely to do so in population because our population is doubling every 10 to 15 years. It's just growing so fast. And we're getting all your immigrants. So you are going to lose the population race, you might say. But don't worry, says Benjamin Franklin. We will be loyal colonists because we love being, part British subjects of the king. Well, the British didn't believe it. And they started in 1770, 1762, 63 to try to keep the Americans down by all these economic restrictions, including taxing them without representation, sure. But what they understood, the American elites like Sam Adams, John Adams, Ben Franklin, etc., Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson understood, is that if we allow the British to do these things to us, we will always be a less industrial power. We won't be able to grow our economy, and we will therefore be restricted by them. And politically, that will hurt us. We will not be able to be free. That is true. But we need to fight a war, not for the freedom, because we have British freedoms. We have to fight a war for economic unity and economic power so that we can grow our economy. That, in a nutshell, is why, in the end, after 12 years of negotiation, the Americans declared independence and fought a long war. Now, fast forward to 1806 and 1810 and 1811. Well, the British were again trying to keep the Americans down economically. That was partly or mostly because Britain was fighting a clear war of survival with Napoleon. And Napoleon was blockading Britain from trading with the continent of Europe. So Britain had to respond by blockading Napoleon. And they did so by blockading and stopping American trade with the continent. Now, that, of course, is a classic example of negative expectations of future trade. If Britain is able to keep us from trading both with Britain and with the continent, then we will decline. We, the Americans, are a growing power, but if we get these restrictions on us, we will peak and decline, and therefore we will be vulnerable as a great power, a growing great power. In a nutshell, it was Madison, the president in 1811, who realized after talking with Thomas Jefferson and after talking with James Madison, his Secretary of State, Madison realized that he had to fight a war to get the trade opened again. And he attacked where I'm from. He attacked Canada. He attacked and burnt Toronto and tried to take Montreal. The British fought back. They fought the War of 1812 for about 2.5 years. And eventually it was a stalemate, and they agreed on a peace in 1815. And that seemed to solve the problem. The British allowed freer trade with Europe, of course, and Napoleon was defeated, so that was allowed to go forward. But the origins of the war are in this negative expectation of trade. And I'll give you one final irony, Deepak. Woodrow Wilson, the great Wilsonian, was also a great historian of American history, and he had studied the War of 1812 very carefully. And in 1913, in 1914, 15, and 16, he went back, and I've seen this in the documents. He went back to the War of 1812 and said, what we, the Americans, are dealing with now is very similar. We can't trade with Europe, or at least the British are putting restrictions on us, but the Germans are sinking our merchant boats. They're trying to prevent us from even trading with Britain again. We must get involved, like the War of 1812, in some kind of war. Now, this one wasn't with Britain because Britain was playing it nice this time. It was a war with Germany, who were being the nasty ones. But it was very parallel for Wilson, and it was very parallel, of course, for this larger perspective that I'm talking about, which is that a rising state, in this case, the Americans, were being restricted by the state that felt it was on the decline. And what the lesson is, of course, is American policymakers now avoid those mistakes. Avoid thinking that you can keep China down by economic restrictions, decoupling or tariffs, and think that that's not going to lead to an immediate and very powerful reaction from the rising power, including the possibility of missile standoffs or standoffs in naval power and actual regional war. And I worry about that because you think about what was happening just a month and a half ago with the high tariffs. Well, they've got a temporary reprieve, don't they? They've gone from 150% tariffs or so down back down to 25 or 30%, and but it's only for a short time. And if they don't resolve that and they go back to super high tariffs, the Chinese are going to react. They may not immediately attack Taiwan. That may not be the best economic response, but they are certainly going to respond with this very globalized navy they now have. And they have naval bases in Sri Lanka, Western Africa, Eastern Africa. They're even thinking about a naval base on the shores of South America. So we, the Americans, I'm Canadian, but we, the Americans, have to worry about that. And I think we have good parallels in history to know what the lessons are.
In your view, are we witnessing a similar pattern today in US China relations? How do trade tensions and technological competition increase the risk of confrontation?
Well, we can talk about this in a number of ways. We can look at the highest of high tech sector, the competition for semiconductors that are under 10 nanometers in width. In other words, the ones that are used for AI, artificial intelligence, as well as, of course, for high tech cars and so forth. Well, these chips, we sometimes call it a chip war, uh, Chris Miller's famous book or well-known book. But the chip war is going to be ongoing. We are struggling, Americans are struggling to stay at the top of at least the development of these chips, if not the production. The production has been dominated by Taiwan. And if you want a parallel to history, then if the Americans are strong in high tech and control it, at least with their uh, allies, which include Japan, South Korea, and indirectly Taiwan, that alliance, we actually call it a chip four, number four, alliance of US, South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan, if that can control and maintain a dominance in this highest of high tech chip development and production, then the Americans will probably feel safe. The Chinese won't like it, but maybe they won't be able to do much about it. But of course, the Chinese are developing their own high tech technology. and they're finding ways to produce at least some of these highest of high tech chips for their own use, Huawei and so forth. Well, that could lead to a major conflict. It could lead to a conflict because guess what? Taiwan is the world's leading producer of these high tech chips. And the Chinese might just feel if they're being cut off, that they have to take over Taiwan to get those factories to produce the goods, produce the highest of high tech chips. Now, it's not a good strategy. Why? Because they might destroy the factories through war, but they also need outside supplies of raw materials and parts, including Dutch machines that make these chips, to be able to produce the highest of high tech chips. So by attacking Taiwan, they might find themselves cut off from the very things that allow those factories to produce important goods, important high tech goods. So that could be a response attacking Taiwan for the chip manufacturing. But I think it would be an irrational response and a foolish response. But these things happen. Japan attacked Southeast Asia in 1941 to get the oil of Sumatra, was able to achieve that for a while, but then of course lost the war. So I think China will be smarter than Japan was in 1941. Now, other things, the larger issue is really critical here, and that is what do these trade-offs, what do these potential cutoffs in trade between the US and China mean for China's domestic stability? That's actually the larger question for me because China has had a history going back 2,500 years of having revolts or revolutions that overthrow dynasties due to economic chaos within its own state. And part of that has been driven by economic interdependence. The Silk Road was very important to the Tang Dynasty, and when that got out of hand and, in fact, led to a revolt by military commanders from Central Asia, the Tang Dynasty never recovered. Now, that's about 750 uh, CE, so it's a long time ago. But there was another situation in the late Ming Dynasty of the 1580s, 1590s, where a war with Japan, which was partly over silver and commerce, but also a cutoff of silver from Spanish America, led to the Chinese collapse, or at least a great decline in its economic vitality. And that led to the loss of legitimacy for the Ming Emperor and led to the Qing Emperor, or at least the Qings from what was called Manchuria or Manchu, to come in and take over the Chinese Empire. And that led to a 300-year Qing Empire occupation by really a foreign power from the Chinese point of view. Now, the parallels here are a little bit scary for Xi Jinping. He's got a country of 1.3 billion people, maybe 1.4. India and China have the largest populations in the world, but China has a difficult problem because it's a large country, but only one third of the land is really arable. And 90% of the Chinese population lives in what I like to call the little egg, the egg-shaped area of the coastal part of China. And Tibet, Xinjiang province in the west, and Manchuria are largely, and Mongolia and Inner Mongolia are not good for farming and for larger, basic production. So what does that mean? It means that this 1.2 billion people are in this small territory or relatively small territory, smaller than certainly the size of India, and they are concentrated in big cities and could become very revolutionary. Think of Tiananmen Square 1989 if of course they find themselves without food, without ability to grow their own personal nest eggs and feel confident about the future. And that has led to revolution in the past, and Xi Jinping is worried it might lead to revolution in the future. How do we know this, by the way? Some people say, oh, Xi Jinping's not worried about revolution. He's got a surveillance state. He watches everyone with cameras. Well, first of all, he put those in place because he's worried about revolution. But two things. First of all, Xi Jinping spent the first 3 months of his tenure in office, late 2012 and early 2013, focus on one thing. Why Tiananmen Square and why did the Soviet Union collapse? And he recognized that it had a lot to do with economic decline and expectations of the population, or at least China was in the midst of economic dislocation, and the majority of the population was not seeing the benefits from reforms, and they therefore revolted. And it got very much out of hand to the point where Deng Xiaoping had to order the attack on Tiananmen Square. Well, that is a scary wake up call, even in the modern age. But 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, there was a banking crisis in the Henan province where people were, you know, cheated out of their life savings by corrupt bank managers and corrupt officials, just largely in the Henan area. But it started to spread. It started to get out of hand, protests in the streets again. People in other provinces of China worrying about their own life savings, worried about these mortgages on apartments that hadn't been finished and were in ghost cities around China, and saying, hey, the Chinese government is against us again. Well, guess what? The PLA, the People's Liberation Army, brought tanks onto the streets in Henan province. And the tanks were very reminiscent of 1989. They were there to say, obviously the confidence in the police was not enough. They had to bring in the People's Liberation Army. It was a signal to the population, get back into your homes, get off the streets, and stop this nonsense. And they did it very quickly. The tanks were within about a week of the protests starting. Now, that is a sign that China still has to worry and it has to respond with ultimate pressure, that is, military army pressure. And I'll just finish this long discussion by saying the history of China shows that when the military of China goes abroad, especially into Korea or attacking Japan during the 1200s, they have usually had domestic problems at home. Why? Because the military's abroad, so they can't keep the peace at home. And the costly adventures abroad tend to hurt the economy at home, which leads to, again, economic decline at home. So, China's strategy, in a nutshell, keep the peace at home. That's the most important thing by continuing to trade abroad, continuing to grow the economy by 3 or 4% a year, and avoiding large scale conflicts abroad that might cause domestic problems at home.
During the Cold War, how did the United States balance its commercial interest with its security alliances, especially in cases where trade with adversary might have brought economic benefits?
So you're talking specifically about the Cold War period, and how does commerce both tie to the alliance structure of the United States, but
Yes.
also to the relationship with the Soviet Union? Well, fortunately, in the new book, World Safer Commerce, I have 3 whole chapters on that very question. Now, it's going to be long to get into the details, but I look at the origins of the Cold War, the ending of the Cold War, and a lot of the crises of the Cold War as being very much tied to, you guessed it, commerce, to trade expectations, to worries about the Soviet Union expanding its own economic power sphere at the expense of the American power sphere. So let's start in 1941, or really 1940, with what the Americans were worried about. When the Nazi Germans, the Germans overran Western Europe and Norway and had control of most of Europe really by 1940, the American response was basically what we call containment. Let's surround the Nazi German Empire, the growing empire, with our economic and military power. Now, initially it was economic, but we the Americans, and again I'm Canadian, wanted to go from Britain through, after the war at least, Western Europe, Italy, and India, which was British at the time, all the way to China and Japan to make sure that whoever won the World War II, and they thought at the time it would be Nazi Germany, would be surrounded. It would not be able to control Middle East oil or the larger economic power sphere that the Americans had in the Western sphere, Western Hemisphere, Africa, and Asia. That was the initial strategy. But of course, once the and one part of this strategy was to for FDR to throw a lot of money to help the Soviet Union in 1941, 42 survive the onslaught of Nazi Germany. So the Soviets did 90% of the fighting for the Western alliance of Britain, the US, and the Soviet Union. And they won. They won with American military aid, but it was their fighting, their troops that did the job. Well, then by 43, guess what? The Americans have a new problem. The Soviets are going to win uh, at least part of Eurasia. They may win some parts of Western Europe if they're not stopped. How do we prevent the Soviets from doing what we feared the Nazis would do and taking over Eurasia? Well, the Americans were very smart. And I show that in 1943, way before George Kennan and containment was announced in 47, the Americans already had a strategy based around the one in 1940 of surrounding now the Soviet Union with this very strong economic power sphere. And it was a trading sphere, of course, as well. And by 45, the Americans had a modus vivendi. They had a relationship with Stalin enough so that Stalin knew that he couldn't go further. He couldn't go into Western Europe. They would split Germany, even split Berlin. And Stalin said, great, we'll allow this as long as you give us trade. Give us trade and give us loans to buy your goods like you did during the war, and we'll be happy. Good. Well, guess what? FDR said no, not Truman. Truman gets a bad name for being the one who was the one who really pushed hard, or a good name, if you will, against the Soviet Union. But it was FDR, of all people, who in early 45 said, we are not going to give loans to the Soviet Union. We're not going to do away with these military bases that we're setting up in all places all around that rim of the Soviet Union because we're not sure what the Soviet Union will do in the future. So, long story short, the Cold War for me has less to do with the Soviets trying to, expand communism, which they were doing, and more to do with the American fear that unless they set up this very powerful sphere which controlled three-quarters of the world's landmass and economy and had military bases all around it, unless they did this early, 43, 44, 45, that the Soviets would be able to expand. All right, so that's the economic side of this. And the economic side has a lot to do as well with the fear that Western Europe would economically turn communist or go politically communist and then economically join the Soviet sphere. And the Soviet sphere would keep expanding at the expense of the American sphere. So that's my explanation. I think it's in chapter 7 for the Cold War itself. Now, I could go in detail about the end of the Cold War and the crises in between, but a couple of high points here. 1953, the near war with the Soviet Union over Iran, not Korea, Iran, had a lot to do with the fact that the Soviets looked like they were going to get a puppet state, a communist puppet state in Iran through a domestic revolution. And the Americans had to work very hard to overthrow the current nationalist Mossadegh and also put down the Communist Party within Iran to keep the Soviets from penetrating right all the way to the Persian Gulf. And that, of course, has always been a longstanding fear that the Soviet Union would get a foothold in the Persian Gulf and then control oil, or at least deny us and the Europeans oil. So, again, a fear of the future economic side. Let me just shut my window for a second here. Good. Yeah, so the Iranian crisis of 53 is very interesting because Eisenhower himself thought that what he called a general war, which meant nuclear war, might actually happen over Iran if the Soviets didn't back away. And the Soviets smartly backed away. They Stalin had died by this point, and the new leadership needed breathing space. So that didn't turn into a war. But you look at the documents, you realize, oh my gosh, they really thought it might happen. Cuban Missile Crisis is an interesting one we can talk about. But the long story about the ending of the Cold War has everything to do with the Soviet need for trade. They had been completely shut off since 45, 46 from trade with the Western sphere, or at least with the US. And they needed that trade back because they had been growing for a while through their own means. But like China recognized in the 1980s, they need the trade to keep growing. And the Americans were not allowing that to happen. So there's an initial attempt by Khrushchev, actually, in the late 50s, which is unknown to most people, to get trade going with Eisenhower in exchange for some compensation, or at least, Soviets reducing their missiles and so forth. Well, it didn't go forward. We had a Cuban Missile Crisis. We can talk about that. But then there was the detente of 1971, 72, that again was based around the Americans promising trade and improving expectations of future trade for the Soviet Union in exchange for the American Soviet help to get out of Vietnam and Soviet reduction of missiles and Soviet stability in the Middle East or Soviet reluctance to intervene. That actually worked for a while. And then it fell out, and Reagan and so forth, they got into a new Cold War. But why did Reagan, of all people, help end the Cold War? Because he knew Gorbachev needed the trade and technology. Once again, they dangled that expectation of future trade and technology to get the Soviets to back away from their strong policies. They got out of Afghanistan, they got out of Eastern Europe, in fact, and they were promised the trade and technology. That ended the Cold War. It ended the Cold War before the Soviet Union ended, by the way. So the collapse of the Soviet Union was an offshoot of all of this. It wasn't the strategy. They didn't expect the Soviet Union to collapse. All of this was very good because it meant that trade could be used as a lever, as a carrot, if you will, to dangle in front of the adversary to get the adversary to be more positive or more moderate. And this was what we did with the Chinese. We did with the Americans kept the trade going with the Chinese so that they could grow their economy. And we saw this in just the last 3 or 4 weeks. The Americans realized that trying to cut the Chinese off could lead, or at least putting up very high tariffs, could lead to a disaster. So they very quickly backed away from that. I think they wanted to restore positive Chinese expectations of trade and give the Chinese again that liberal reason for wanting to continue a good relationship, militarily good relationship with the Americans. Uh, can we continue this? Can we make sure that both sides continue positive expectations of trade? I think so. But it's going to take diplomacy and it's going to take a recognition that the downside of decoupling, the downside of cutting each other off through tariffs or other mechanisms, is a repeat of the historical wars and conflicts and Cold Wars, dangerous Cold Wars like the Cuban Missile Crisis period, uh, that can happen because trade is cut off, that trade is low, that expectations of trade are low. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, excellent, Professor Copeland. Professor, my last question. How can policymakers today use historical lessons from your book to better manage rising tensions in the Indo-Pacific, Africa, and Latin America?
Well, it's a huge question, and I don't think we have 2 more hours. So let me see if I
That's fine, Professor. You may please go ahead.
let me see if I can do it in 5 minutes. Okay. And as I say, I'm working on a fourth book on this very issue. Uh, I'm not even sure what to call it yet, but let's just say that it has a lot to do with the lessons of history and these theoretical insights that I think the book provides for thinking about U.S. China. And now I should remind viewers that the last chapter of the new book is a longish chapter called The Future of U.S. Chinese Relations, or Economic Interdependence and the Future of U.S. China Relations. So I'm really quite interested, and I've done a lot of study of how to use the lessons of history and theory to avoid a Cold War, because I don't think we're yet in a Cold War, let alone a real hot war, say a struggle in South China Sea over military bases or control of the Malacca Strait. So let me start with some flashpoints, some areas where there could be real problems. One is Taiwan. Does China want to attack Taiwan either for glory or nationalist reasons or for economic reasons, the chips? That's one flashpoint. The second flashpoint, I think, is the South China Sea and the Malacca Strait, because China gets 80% of its oil. Now, remember, China imports about 80% of its oil. And of that imported oil, 80% comes through the Malacca Strait. Now, that means that there's a choke point. The Chinese have a term for it. They call it the Malacca dilemma. And they want to avoid being cut off, just like the Japanese were cut off from oil. So they are reinforcing the islands in the South China Sea. They have a Chinese presence with their navy. They want to make sure that the Americans will not, or the Indian Navy, to be honest, will not cut them off. And that's deterrence, if you will, from the China point of view. The third flashpoint, I think, uh, we could talk a lot about Putin. I think the Chinese want that war over so they can get trade relations with the Europeans back on track. They want Russia to kind of not go away, but they just want it to be a non-entity. Uh, we can debate that. But the third real flashpoint, I think, is South America, where the Americans have always thought of the Western Hemisphere as their hemisphere, rightly or wrongly, the Monroe Doctrine. But of course, the Chinese see South America and the Caribbean as great trading places, as places to get food, raw materials. They get a lot of lithium for their electric cars from Chile. They get copper and a lot of other critical minerals from South America. They get soybeans and key food items that keep the population happy in China, let alone from starving, uh, yeah, from South America, especially Brazil. They need those relations. And China's Belt Road Initiative is going way beyond just Asia and Africa. It's going right into South America. And from the American point of view, at least if it's just economic, okay, you're helping these countries grow economically. But there's also that edge that if you let a country grow economically, will they turn into a more military presence? We can talk about how Sri Lanka became home to a military base for China. That was part of a Belt Road initiative that didn't go well. And the Sri Lankans said, okay, you can have that port. Well, that could happen. That could happen in South America. And this would really upset the Americans. Even those who are soft on China would say that's not acceptable. No military bases in the American hemisphere. Guess what happened in 1961, 62 when it looked like they were putting missiles in Cuba? That led to a Cuban Missile Crisis. I don't suspect that this will happen again. And I think the Chinese are smart enough to avoid that. But guess what they're doing in the Caribbean, the Chinese? They now have or are building a special economic zone on the island of Antigua. Small island, 100,000 people. It's an island nation. And this special economic zone will have surveillance technology that can listen in on a huge amount of foreign discussions or discussions that are going on between the US and Latin America. And it could, of course, they're not going to do it, I think, turn into some sort of visiting naval base. The Chinese Navy has visited a number of countries in the Caribbean and South America. And usually it's a military ship that's made into a medical ship so that the population at home can get free eye care, free, shots, vaccines. And they're smart. It's a soft power way of putting China into that hemisphere without upsetting the Americans. Now, it's a fine line when it gets to a point when China's growing economy and growing naval power looks like a threat rather than something that's helping South America. So those three things, those three flashpoints are big. My basic view is the following, that if you reorient one's notion of what China wants, China does not want what the Americans achieved in 45 to 1960. That is global hegemony, where, again, I've talked about this big area of dominance. They don't want to lock up three-quarters of the world in their sphere and then cut everyone else off. Why would they want to do that First of all, because their history shows that leads to revolts at home when their navy is abroad. But second of all, it would lead to Chinese quagmires like Vietnam, where they feel they have to fight for reputation in Southeast Asia. They don't want that kind of thing. They're worried about domestic stability. And if you reorient, if we, the world, can reorient ourselves away from this notion that the Chinese are driven like any great power of the 19th century to have big empires abroad, and think about Chinese history and say China wants uh, itself to be the center of political and economic issues, but it doesn't want military empire. And every time it's tried to do it in the past 2,000 years, it's led to collapse at home. What it wants, therefore, above and beyond all else, is domestic legitimacy, the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party, and therefore stability at home. And if we think in those terms, we realize that what China is really all about, with its building up of its navy and its Belt Road Initiative and its interventions economically, not interventions, but its connections economically with Brazil and South America, is to continue to grow its economy by at least 2 to 3% a year. That's what normal, stable industrial economies can achieve when they're doing well, 2 to 3% a year. China's out of the era of 10%, 12% growth. They can't get that. They can't even get the 7% that Xi Jinping promised when he first got into power. His new normal, as he calls it, is going to be 3% growth. Guess what? That's good because the Americans are getting, if they play it right, about 3%. And both economies can grow about the same speed and therefore not fear the other's long term future overtaking. The Americans don't have to fear China if China gets 2 to 3% growth, but the Chinese don't have to fear a decline if they are cut off by the Americans worried about, guess what, Chinese growth. So there's a what I would call a Goldilocks point here. Goldilocks, the story of the person, the little girl who knew that the porridge was not too hot or too cold, but just right. You got to find that middle point, that golden mean, as Aristotle called it, where everything kind of works, but it has to work as a mix. It has to work as a mix of continuing American strength economically and politically and militarily, so that, is deterrence, but you also mix it with continued economic engagement, not decoupling, but engagement, coupling with China, so that China has positive expectations for the future. And if it does, then it will expect to grow by 2 to 3%. It won't have to go after Taiwan because that would be a disaster, let alone if it caused a lot of sanctions like we did on Russia after an invasion of Ukraine. China can grow that 2 to 3%. China can keep its domestic situation stable. And guess what? It can also feel like it can support a navy that is largely, in the Alfred Thayer Mahan sense, a navy that goes and protects trade routes. The Malacca Strait, the Persian Gulf connection, the copper from Zambia, the raw materials from Chile, all of those kinds of things. The Navy can do that because that's what all great powers do. Mahan, famous Alfred Thayer Mahan of 1890, set down the ground rules for America's naval growth. Yes, go abroad with your navy, protect your trade routes. But China is only following in what the Germans and the Japanese and, of course, the British set forward, which is you need a strong navy more than anything to protect trade. If we the Americans, again Canadian, uh, keep that in mind and know that there's a domestic reason, stability at home, for why China is doing all of this, then we can avoid hyper fear, this hyper fear that the Chinese are going to go crazy like Hitler or Stalin and take over the world. No, it's not in their own self-interest. That would cause, like the Ming Empire, it would cause an overthrow of the dynasty. And the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party dynasty, is not that old. It's not yet 100 years. And the Ming lasted 300 years, the Qing lasted 300 years, but a lot of the Chinese empires uh, before that lasted 25, 30 years or 100 years. And almost all of them fell for the same reasons, domestic instability at home. So we can play our cards right. We can actually encourage China to grow 2 to 3% a year. It can't get 10%. Nobody can get 10% anymore. But we can encourage it and allow it to grow 2 to 3% so that it doesn't go negative. Doesn't go negative 2%, negative 5%. That's when bad stuff happens. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Dale Copeland, for joining us on today's episode and for sharing your deep insights into the enduring relationship between commerce and American foreign policy. Your book, A World Safe for Commerce, offers a powerful historical lens through which we can better understand the dilemmas facing US policymakers today. By tracing how trade, national security, and shifting balance of power have shaped American decisions from the revolution to the rise of China, you have given us a compelling framework for analyzing current tensions and the sobering yet hopeful perspective on the road ahead. As we grapple with the challenges of a rapidly evolving global order, your work reminds us that the choices great powers make about economic openness and strategic competition are never easy and they are deeply consequential. Thank you once again, Professor Dale Copeland. It's been an honor to have you with us today. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you very much, Deepak. It's been an honor to be here. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you.